Okay, everybody. I'm here to do my another weekly broadcast. Today is August 1st, 2017. We're going to talk and continue where we left off with the Pluto, how Pluto is making a major dynamic change in the body politic in this collective psyche of the nation. And last week, we also talked about how Uranus liberates the repressed Plutonian Dionysian impulse, invoking drastic social upheaval, changes. It emancipates the erotic, the libidinal. It loosens the social restraints. It evokes the deeper eruptions at the body politic of a nation at a violent, volcanic level. It has a very disruptive elemental energy to its nature. It also unleashes the primitive, destructive forces accompanied by a collective atmosphere of stormy, intense, morose moodiness that's reflected in extreme emotional ordeals of the population and people who are going through dramatic transformations. Also, we talked about a little bit about how the collective works through and goes through changes based on the work of Carl Jung, where he quotes that the psychology of the individual is reflected in the psychology of the nation, and that this principle operates not only in the natal charts and psyches of individuals, but is also could be seen operating within the psyche and natal charts of nations. So that being the inner dynamics that are parallel within a man or a woman, all right, are also apparent in the outer dynamics of a society, or what we call the masses, or the mass. Jung states that the collective forces within a nation can encourage a man or woman to act out of him or herself, of no longer obeying to his or own conscience, but becoming simply a part of their own impersonal mob. So essentially what he's saying here is that the collective psyche has a way of indirectly shaping and impacting our own personal lives, our own personal issues at a deeper level. And when these forces operate, and they are compelling, and they form and inform and shape the destiny of our lives, just like our own decision making shapes the destiny and narrative of our lives. So we have to be aware of these mass forces that are at work and are highly active and become activated when these outer planetary bodies constellate, where situations can develop where a nation itself goes through its own neurotic and, in some cases, psychotic breakdown or mental illness. As Jung stated, the masses are always breeding grounds of psychic epidemics if government and its social institutions are no longer able to make the levels of change and adjustments to the demands of the collective that are brewing within the overall psyche of that nation. So that's one of the issues that I tried to drive home over the past few weeks, and I'd like to go a little deeper with it. Now, Jung's point was that nations, like individuals, can be described psychologically, and further, nations have their own psychological self-actualization process, and that also implies their own psychological illnesses and disassociations that can result in neuroses and breakdowns. So we have to look at the mass of a nation, and we can look at it just like we look at an individual. So I talked about this in relevance in particular to what we see with the Pluto Sun transit, the transiting Pluto to the natal sun of the U.S. chart. Interestingly enough, right now as I speak, transiting Pluto is on near the ascendant of the moment as we discuss this matter. Okay, so going back, we can see that transiting Pluto for the past 7 or 8 years has been making a direct impact on the U.S. sun, July 4th or even July 2nd chart. No matter what horoscope that you use, all right, as an astrologer or any mundane astrologer, if you're using a July 2nd or July 4th chart, if you're using the Sibley chart, using the Hancock ratification chart, which is the one I use, but any chart would still have would still have this Pluto-Sun dynamic activating within the collective psyche. It would be something that has to be addressed along with the greater Uranus-Pluto alignment that's been operative since 2007. Now, this transit has been operative in particular using a 5-degree narrow range of orb, although in mundane astrology we use larger orbs. This is something that many financial astrologers find very confounding because they use very narrow orbs to make their trade. In mundane astrology, we use much wider orbs because we also look at the collective buildup, activation, and then wind down of how a planetary energy constellates and manifests on the world stage. And what we often notice is on the wind down or on the waning phase of the aspect that we see more events that are relative to the activation actually occur. So it's in the wind down of the Uranus-Pluto, or it's in the wind down of the Pluto-Sun transit, we are going to see more developments akin that reveal their symptoms more so than during the buildup or the actual activation moment itself. So talking about that, we've seen Pluto activating the U.S. sun since 2012, around the time of late 2012 with the Mayan event on December 21st, 2012, which was a galactic event. All right, there was a galactic convergence or transition where where we see the galactic center completely align with the with the solstice point. So we're seeing a convergence of that along with the Uranus-Pluto alignments that became active in 2007. All right, and then there was a number of other transits occurring around that time. And then on top of it, as another layer, we have the Pluto-Sun direct opposition to the U.S. chart. So let's talk about the Pluto-Sun transit again. We'll talk about it on a personal level, and then we're going to talk about it on the collective level, and then we're going to take it to another level, particularly in the area of economics and finances, which is really revealing its symptoms most intensely now with the markets. So astrologically, we see that the Pluto-Sun transits on a personal level reveal itself most obviously through symptoms that include a thirst for power, a need for control, compulsive, obsessive behavior, an intense fear of vulnerability or being exposed, introversion, detective-like curiosity, a fascination with the mysterious, a fascination with the taboo, a fascination with what lurks below, a fascination with one's psychology, an exaggerated fear of loss, an exaggerated fear of death. It deals with depression and anxiety, revealing itself through the upset stomach, the racing heart, the night sweats. It reveals itself through the insatiable hunger for money, for power, for sex, or for security that it supposedly provides. It's also a tendency towards triangulation, the inevitable betrayals, the penetrating insights into one's own underpinnings or others' motives, or the revelations or true revelations, or deeper, or the revelations of others' true motivations, which are often provocative. A suspicion with the unknown, with the unfamiliar. A hearty, intense, and passionate sexual appetite is often constellated, which is often colored with distrust and honesty, an exaggerated sense of fear of loss again, powerful resourcefulness, survival capacity. It invokes our instinctive mechanism to survive and thrive at all cost. It has very much to do with giving us the necessary endurance and resilience in time of crisis. And it's a refusal to let go, and a tendency to accumulate resentments, which is often one of the more negative connotations of the Sun-Pluto transit. It's very much connected with vengeance, vengeful behavior, a quiet but powerfully pronounced sense of competitiveness, the will to power, the will to win at any cost, um, uh, the sense of all's well that ends well. All right, that is one of the many symptoms. And we could go on about this, but this is some of the class book expressions that reveal its most obvious symptoms of the Sun-Pluto complex on a personal level. And we can see that very much playing out with our leadership. We could see that playing out in the leadership of not only with the president, but with people in power in general. We see that with CEOs. We see that with people who are running our social institutions. We see that playing itself out in our own communities. We see that playing itself out in our own companies that we work for. We see that playing itself out with the power struggles that take place inside of small businesses and companies and large-scale companies. And we're seeing it play itself out in a more powerful way on a mundane level with the deeper political reform that Pluto evokes through coercive grassroots anti-elitist movements. And we've seen that really begin in earnest in 2011 onward with the Occupy Wall Street movement and the major disruptions in the Middle East through the Arab Spring. And we see the purging of the body politic in those areas of the world of deeply rooted political families and dysfunctional power structures that have gone on for generations. We're seeing that play out now with the implosion of both the Democratic and Republican Party. The radical liberal elements that infected the Democratic Party in 1968, and the ultra-conservative, reactionary, collectivist Republican elements or conservative elements that infected the party in 1988 with the election of George Bush. So we're seeing a purging of the body politic of the nation's deeply rooted political families, a massive disruption of the dysfunctional power structures that operate within the very aspects of the deep state structure or the national security structure through the exposition and revelations of Edward Snowden's disclosures. We've seen that all erupt since 2013. We're seeing the creation of developments that evoke deep-seated titanic shifts in the body politic and in society that partly resulted in that most obvious manifestation resulted in the leadership of Donald Trump and his presidency. And when these developments occur historically, they often accompany a breakdown of unsustainable and untenable ways of living, ways of life, structures, followed by some type of major reconfiguration before some healing or recovery can occur. So generally, we see a breakdown in society, a breakdown in economy, a breakdown in the very fundamental things that were always considered immutable. When these Plutonian, deeper Dionysian, Plutonian symptoms reveal themselves. And Pluto also makes us aware of the once invisible but now detectable intervention of the deep state and its coercive political manipulations of influencing and manipulating anti-democratic coalitions in a covert manner within the political system. So the purpose for this manipulation is essentially to ensure specific private and powerful interests of the power elite are met with within a seemingly democratic framework, right? So the manipulation of democracy, where democracy no longer functions within a constitutional framework, all right, in order to ensure the long-term agenda of a government that operates within a government. And this would be one of the ways we would define the deep state. Also, we've seen, as I mentioned just slightly earlier, the exposure of the deep state with Edward Snowden's revelations and disclosures and its takeover of foreign policy, where he revealed in the documentation that he releases daily on the internet how the deep state has basically infected the foreign policy directives of the nation, ensuring the implementation of its long-term policies of world control and to enforce other nations into compliance, including America's so-called allies, against their own long-term economic and political interests in order to ensure America's future global hegemony and economic dominance, while projecting the perception to the world through the public media that it is a functional capitalistic democracy. So that's another element of how Pluto is manifesting very powerfully, where you have the fake news, or what we call the mainstream media, which is basically a mouthpiece of the deep state. And then you have the alternative media that has merged very powerfully as of late and now is seeped into the social media, and where you have two different narratives going on about what's really happening in the world, what's happening in the news. So the deep state is connected and tied in with Pluto. And the deep state in the United States in particular is essentially the secret government superstate structure that began around the time of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1947 and continued to gain leverage and power, all right, over time, eventually superseding the power of the executive itself, steering the defense and foreign policy behind the facade of a democracy, which finances itself through massive banking manipulation, international drug trafficking of networks, and a powerful shadow banking system of derivatives. The Pluto-Sun alignment in the U.S. horoscope relates to the rise of the plutocratic elements in the body politic. And we've seen that more so. And it's very much connected not only with international foreign policy confrontation, but also with titanic geopolitical power plays. We saw this very much with the emergence of the Cold War, which is one of the justifiable reasons of the creation of the deep state. So the emergence of the Cold War with the former Soviet Union. Now, bringing it back to today, the Uranus-Pluto alignment has been making direct hits to the natal sun, as I pointed out, since 2012. And since that time to present, we've seen the last administration making essentially making negligent and rubber stamping globalist policies and doctrine that supersede both domestic, economic, and foreign policy. So what's happened is that the deep state has now infected the most public sectors of power now, including the White House, where we saw the Obama administration is simply rubber stamp globalist agenda. And we saw this especially most poignantly during his second term of office, where the main focus was the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the most important focus for the Obama administration in regards to his foreign policy initiative. Now, while the other thing that was going on that the mainstream financial media and including the alternative media was sort of looking away from was the fact that the Federal Reserve, in coordination with the Obama administration and the Wall Street elite and the Wall Street banksters, were implementing extend and pretend policies and financial means to pump up the markets, to pump up through the manipulation of the interest rates and markets while announcing rosy job numbers, skewing the numbers, skewing the facts and statistics, and essentially putting out fake news and economic data that the economy on Main Street was improving. And as things continue to improve on Wall Street, things went from bad to worse on Main Street. Now, many people have challenged me on this, especially many of the British astrologers who claim to have a deep understanding of American economics. So I want to point out now why I make this statement that over the last 8 years, the U.S. economy, or let's even go back, over the past 10 years, that the U.S. economy has grown at exactly the same rate as it did during the Great Depression. Okay, if we go back to 2007 with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, all right, you will see that the U.S. economy grew at 1.2%. If we go back to 1930, at the onset of the Great Depression, through 1939, the U.S. economy grew at 1.2%. All right, so don't take my word for it. Let me read it out loud, and I will post this in a few minutes. 1930, the gross domestic product of the United States was negative 8.5%. Then in 31, the gross domestic product was negative 6.4%. Then in 1932, negative 12.9%. 1933, negative 1.3%. 1935, 8.9% gross domestic product. 1936, 12.9%, 1937, 5.1%, 1938, negative 3.3%, 1939, positive 8%. So when you average all of those years together, you get an average rate of economic growth of 1.33%. That is really bad, but it's the kind of number that one would expect from a Great Depression. So now here are the numbers of the so-called Obama recovery that the mainstream media bought into, that the Democratic Party accepted verbatim, that the Obama administration pontificated, and that a majority of the astrological world didn't even consider looking into because they believed the numbers being put out were accurate and reflected a recovery. And that's part of the reason they predicted a decisive Hillary Clinton victory. All right, so let me read out what those numbers are. In 2007, the gross domestic product was 1.8%. In 2008, it was 0.3%. In 2009, it was negative 2.8%. In 2010, it was 2.5%. In 2011, it was 1.6%. In 2012, it was 2.2%. In 2013, it was 1.73%. That's when Barack Obama basically announced that the economy is on the full road to recovery. In 2014, it was 2.4%. In 2015, it was 2.6%. And 2016, on the State of the Union address, when he announced that the economy is completely recovered, and we are now in a period of expansion, the economy grew at 1.6%, right? So when you average all those years together, you get an average rate of economic growth of 1.33%. That is the same number. The same number as the Great Depression. And yet, everybody claims there is no recession. There never was. We were never even close to a depression. So since Obama announced the end of the Great Recession in June of 2009, the mainstream media has continued to push the perception that the U.S. economy is in full recovery. But the truth is that the current era has far more in common with the Great Depression than it does with the great economic prosperity of the 1980s, when we saw a true recovery under the Reagan administration. Despite what many in the mainstream media continue to tell you, the reality of the matter is that Trump inherited an economy that is deeply, deeply troubled. And I'm going to give you a number of facts that are based on real economic statistics that prove out what I'm saying here, that Trump inherited a deeply troubled and broken economy. All right? So when I give you these facts, keep in mind that I'm going to present this to give you the framework about what I'm going to say next about what is happening now in America. So I want you to pay attention to these facts. Don't just marginalize them in your mind or play it down or just say that can't be true, William, because if it was true, they would have talked about it. Number one fact, nearly 7 out of 10 of Americans have less than 1,000 in their savings. That means that about 2/3 of the country is essentially living paycheck to paycheck at this moment. Fact number two, Reuters is reporting that the U.S. small investors are poised to lose billions of dollars in a retail apocalypse as this crisis deepens. We see Sears going out of business, Kmart. We see a reduction of over 22 stores, with Walmart, the largest retailer in the world, that has been recently surpassed by Amazon.com. We see Radio Shack. I could list the number of stores that have been staples for a majority of Americans for the past 40 to 50 years since World War II are going out of business and have reduced their brick and mortar presence by 50 to 60%. And that includes Macy's as well. All right. So that's the number two fact, that right now we're seeing ghost malls appear all over the country, and U.S. mall investors, all right, local and national, are losing billions per month. Credit card delinquencies. Fact number three, credit card delinquencies have hit their highest level since 2009. Approximately 35% of all Americans have a debt that's at least 180 days past due, all right? And fact number five, the rate of home ownership has fallen for 8 years in a row and now hovering near a 50-year low as house prices continue to rise. As house prices continue to rise, all right, home ownership falls. We are becoming a nation, instead of a nation of homeowners, we are becoming a nation of renters, chronic renters on a generational level. Number six, the total number of government employees now outnumbers the total number of manufacturing employees in this country by almost 10 million since 2009. Since 2009, okay, when the economy officially recovered, all right? But wait, there's more. There's more. The number of homeless people in New York City, where Donald Trump is from, has hit a brand new record high. About 20% of all young adults, millennials, all right, and that number is actually higher, but I actually lowered it, all right? I lowered it because we know it's at least 20%. It's more closer to 30%, all right? So nearly 30%, between 20 and 30% of all young adults, millennials in particular, are currently living with their parents. Number nine, total household debt in the United States has reached a grand total of $12.3 trillion. Number 10, the total amount of corporate debt in the U.S. has nearly doubled since the end of 2007. And finally, when Barack Obama entered the White House, the U.S. government was $10.6 trillion in debt. Today, the U.S. national debt is currently sitting at a staggering $19.842 trillion. Okay? So these are facts. These are facts I want you to keep in mind, all right, about where I'm going to go next, where things are likely to head to, all right? And look, for all of those of you out there that disagree with me and think Trump is the problem, the reality is Trump did not create this crisis. Both George Bush, all right, and Barack Obama essentially created this crisis. They were the ones responsible for allowing the extend and pretend, the pump and dump economics that are driven by the Wall Street elite and the oligarchy that it serves. That is the real issue that is really going on. And I like to get the astrologers more on board with this, all right? Rather than trying to see this as a partisan debate, looking at it from a much broader view. Now let's go back to the U.S. chart for a minute here, okay? All right, because I want to show something here about the chart. Let me just go back and make an adjustment. Okay, so let's talk about this in terms of what I'm seeing. What we notice here is not only is Pluto opposing the sun, Pluto is right now at 18 degrees of Capricorn, it's hitting the US sun, it's going retrograde now. We also see Uranus, transiting Uranus, squaring Pluto, right? We take this is using, by the way, this is August 21st, 2017. This is the eclipse. The outer wheel here is the eclipse, all right? The upcoming total solar eclipse. So I'm using the transits of that eclipse hitting the planets of the U.S. Declaration of Independence horoscope, all right? And it really doesn't matter which time you use because Uranus is going to hit the Pluto and Pluto is going to hit the sun, all right? Not to mention that we also see a number of other transits, such as transiting Saturn, opposing the U.S. natal Mars. So let's just talk about the Uranus squaring Pluto, because that's a biggie. So remember, we have Uranus in the sky squaring Pluto since 2007, whose activations will still be in effect until 2022 using a Y degree, a 15 degree of orb, all right? So we use that range of orb, or a 10 degree range of orb. It goes between now and 2020, all right? So that's in effect. Then we have Pluto opposing the sun and Uranus squaring Pluto. So we have a triple whammy dynamic activating the U.S. chart at this moment, all right? Now, Uranus squaring to Pluto in itself will effectively sweep away all the old outworn social and political structures that the nation has built upon since the Industrial Revolution. And that revolution occurred approximately 50 years later than the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in 1850. So around 1900, the U.S. Industrial Revolution is complete. So we're going to see a complete wipe, a cleaning of the slate, if you will, all right, of all the old economic, social, and political structures with this transit. For Pluto is the principle, again, of decay, death, transformation, and rebirth, and now combined with the Promethean principle of accelerated evolution, rapid growth, and radical change, the combined effect is one of creating total revolution. Total revolution. But let me explain what that means, all right? Because that means that many of the elements over this past generation, and generation I'm using around 84 years, one Uranus return, all right, if we go back into the 30s, that have essentially served the development and the developmental path of the United States in terms of its self-activation and its manifest destiny, will no longer serve any useful purpose in regard to the nation's ultimate, in terms of the nation's ultimate destiny. So again, what this means is that many elements over the past 80 years in particular will no longer serve any useful purpose in regard to the nation's manifest destiny, and are undergoing some type of rapid collapse. All right, we see this happening in the social institutions. We see this happening with the pension funds. We see this with the breakdown and outsourcing of U.S. companies. We see this with the nuclear family. We see this with the institutional religions. We are seeing this at the municipal levels. We see this with the class warfare that's going on in the urban cities, okay? The events that will occur over the next several years will be dramatic and stunning in fashion and will irrevocably change in both the political, financial, and economy of the nation. Again, because Pluto has to do with death and transformation, rebirth, and that is constellating in a very powerful way and being accelerated by Uranus that's invoking this radical change, a radical change that wants, that seeks, that draws to it, and that desires total revolution, total and complete revolution. So going back to Pluto, as we know, it has to do with these deep psychological collective forces that are at work in the nation's psyche, right? And generally, those forces operate at a very deep level. They happen slowly over time. However, when you have Uranus constellating that Pluto, the impulse is to activate that complex where a lot of these deep-seated forces build up to some critical point and have to be released, often in a volcanic and powerful way. And the volcanic intensity that we're witnessing, not only physically, but right where we see many earthquakes and volcanoes activating, we're seeing it build up in the archetypal, in the constellation of the archetypal shadow, which is a collective psychic element of the nation, right? Anything that's been repressed within the collective psyche of the nation, any elements that have been repressed, kept secret, denied, all right, because they are essentially incompatible with the image that we project to the world, the image that we project in our history books, that you read and watch on the History Channel, anything that goes against that perceived persona, you know, a nation which follows that a constitutional republic that is a land of laws and checks and balances, a land that we project the image of truth, justice, the American way, the pursuit of liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All those things that are bound up with our Constitution, Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and all these social reforms and changes and amendments to our Constitution. All of that image, all right, that image that we project to the world, that people continue to believe and buy into, that makes them go to work in the morning and listen to a boss that just keeps putting them down, to pay that mortgage off, to put their kids to college, to pay compliant citizens, to pay those taxes that continue to go up, where they get less services for, all right? What we're seeing now is a emergence of this archetypal collective shadow in a powerful way of everything that goes against that image, that motivates people, that goes against the mainstream. Right? So we're going to see that all the stuff that's been kept secret, realizing that there are certain elements within our own government that we empower through our wallet, through our vote, that are actually working against our freedom, against our sovereignty, against our privacy. All of this is going to be awakened. So the awakening of the Pluto will create a confrontation, all right, on some level. And this confrontation doesn't only abide at home. It doesn't only stay here. That confrontation will also project itself into the world, or will somehow be part of activating the world shadow at its more animalistic level, constellating the archetypal qualities of the wolf, right? The untamed nature, you know, the envy, contempt, greed, cruelty, murder, avarice, war. These are all a constellation of the world shadow, right? And this is what the Uranus-Pluto, the transiting Uranus to the U.S. Pluto, transiting Pluto to the U.S. Sun, is going to project out and create a confrontation in the world where it's a projection of the world shadow, and we're going to see a collision in power structure, power struggle on an animalistic level. Now, it's very interesting. You see this being played out in Hollywood, right? We see tremendous commercial success with Godzilla and the most recent incarnation of King Kong. And now we're seeing this where with titanic clashes of superheroes on a scale we could never have imagined reading those comic books in the 60s and 70s. We're seeing that all really play out in Hollywood, but it won't stay in Hollywood. It's not going to stay just on your TV screen. It's coming to the world stage in a very powerful way. All right. And we've been witnessing this all come to a head. Now, for those of you that still in question this, don't think, what is this guy talking about? This is just, you're just going over the top again. And I get these comments, by the way, that I'm going over the top. I ask you, all right, we've seen this already come to a head in 2001, where we continue to witness the menacing resurgence of epidemic demonization and collective psychosis in the inevitable violent global collision that's been intensifying and accelerating between radical Islam and Judeo-Christian secular Western culture, each side projecting its collective shadow on the world stage and perceiving the other as evil incarnate. So we're seeing that now play itself out. And for those Americans who still don't want to accept that, most of the European people, especially some European astrologers out there, know exactly what I'm talking about with this illegal, oligarchy-driven immigration that is destroying the very culture and fabric of Europe. It is not something that's just happening organically. It is completely being driven by a psychotic oligarchical narrative. And that is something that people in the astrological community need to wake up to. I think everybody needs to wake up to it. But again, most of the astrologers out there, in my opinion, continue to marginalize this and consider this a mere moral problem on the part of their government. All right. This goes much, much bigger than that. All right. Now, let's go back to the U.S. The constellation of Pluto in the U.S. horoscope agrees that we are in a painful transition. Our government is crushingly expensive. Taxes continue to increase no matter what party gets in power. All right. And our governments, both at the local, municipal, and especially federal level, are failing at its basic functions and unable to keep up with its promises, regardless who we make as president. All right. And, it does not work, and it cannot continue as it is unless there is some type of reform, some major reform. All right. So the drastic changes that people are encountering now are very much connected with these processes, these larger collective processes at work. And, these processes are really part of the result of a deep social economic forces that are impacting us all. And they're impacting us all beyond our control. And for many, these forces seem to be impersonal, but play a vital role in shaping everyone's individual destiny, and most importantly, getting them out of denial, shattering and challenging their belief systems in such a way that the inevitable will be in a way where people, I believe, at some point will hit that tipping point and start taking massive action in terms of their decisions about their values and beliefs, and what decisions they're going to make in terms of their lifestyle, and ultimately what they're going to commit to themselves going forward. All right. So, I really think this is ultimately a positive thing. But what I think ultimately is going to be is that these forces that seem impersonal will play a vital role in shaping the individual destiny of many and challenging the belief systems in such a deep way that people will ultimately take massive action that will change the course and trajectory and narrative and political narrative of this nation, and change the inevitable end of a dysfunctional and corrupt leadership that is pervasive everywhere at every level of government and its social institutions. And this transit, these set of transits do not mean the end of America. For many, there's some astrologers out there that keep telling me every day in every way America's finished, China and Russia are going to take over. You're like the British Empire 2.0 in decline. That is not what I see at all. I see this transformation only means the end of a crumbling and outdated phase of America, while a new America struggles to be born. And I will have that debate with those astrologers who want to challenge me on the Russia, China, or Chindia, China and India belief that they're going to take control. They're going to be the dominant force that sets the narrative for the 21st century. No, what I see is America will set the narrative for the 21st century, just like it did for the 20th century. I don't say this as an American, and those of you who know me, I am very critical of the American government, very critical of the Bush and Obama administrations, very critical, not because I'm trying to make a point, but simply because I'm trying to invoke change, to get people to take action. It's a call to action to wake people up, from their narcotic, from their stupor, all right, and their plausible deniability that I see them articulate on a day-to-day basis on social media. So that's one of the things I want to drive home. This is not the end of America. This is the transition. This is the death and rebirth of America. It's the end of America 2.0, and it's the rebirth of America 3.0. All right? So I want to state that before I go into next what I'm going to talk about here, because what I see happening very soon, and this all is very much connected with the upcoming solar eclipse, all right, has very much to do with the financial situation, the U.S. markets, and the economy. Like I stated earlier, the economy grew 1.9% last year, okay? It only grew 1.9%. In the first half, from January, the first half of 2017, from January to July, the economy grew at a pitiful 1.2%. So we are falling below the 2% growth level in the country, which implies we are already in a recession. In fact, we're much closer to a depression than ever before. Now the Federal Reserve plans to roll off its $5 billion on its balance sheet of treasuries and toxic mortgages-backed securities that they acquired when bailing out the two big to fail Wall Street banks back in 2007 through 2009. So they're going to take all that bad money and try and inject it back into the system and put that into the pension funds and all the other instruments that institutional investors will be encouraged to buy. So, all right, many of them will be sold back into the markets as bonds. Now the question becomes, who's going to purchase all these new collateralized trillions of dollars of bonds? Who's going to purchase all this collateralized toxic instruments, all right, when they create these bonds? Who? All right? And the answer to that is the institutional investors will be coerced by the banks, by their agreements with the too big to fail Wall Street banks, all right? That's the problem. And the other problem is what impact is this going to have when this all commences very soon, starting in August, all right? And I believe what's going to happen is the markets are going to respond to this. So we're going to see bond yields are going to rise dramatically. They're going to rise, and when they rise, it's going to go up very fast. So we're going to see bond yields are going to rise, and thus the prices of bonds, as a result, are going to fall, all right? Meaning that the debt in the bond is worthless. The debt is no longer equivalent to money. So when yields go up, bond prices go down, all right? And as a result, that's going to send an already fragile housing market bubble, auto market bubble, student loan market bubble, credit card market bubble to burst. So what I'm pointing out here is it's not the stock market, it is the bond market, simply because the Federal Reserve is taking all these newly collateralized trillions of dollars of bonds that are composed of all these all these toxic mortgages, right, that they bought off from the too big to fail and too big to jail banks or banksters back in 2009, and they're going to then cease liquidity and raise interest rates as a result, all right? So we're going to see bond yields go up, the price of bonds go down, and we're going to see the collapse of all the various bubbles. We have approximately about 7 different bubbles going on. Now, keep in mind that all the bonds and debt bets are deeply connected with this thing called derivatives and the derivatives market, which is all tied in with the shadow banking system, which is connected with what? Pluto. Pluto is equivalent to derivatives, the derivative markets. Bet on bets. They're bet on bets that have no oversight by any financial or government institution. All right? And, you're basically saying that there are multiple hundreds of trillions of dollars in credit default swaps that are bets, and they have bet that interest rates are never going to rise. So here's the thing. These derivatives, all right, these derivatives or what they call credit default swaps are bets that are connected with the derivatives over the bonds that have bet that interest rates, the Fed will not raise interest rates. And when interest rates rise, because if the Fed does not raise interest rates, once all this bad money or collateralized bonds get injected into the market, what we're going to see is we're going to see interest rates will rise on their own, all right? And when they rise, all right, is when the central banks will remove their thumb from the scale, meaning what they're ultimately going to do is they're basically going to let the bond market go, all right? So that's going to bring chaos to the entire global stock market. And, the Fed has been tightening slowly since 2013 when they began their taper, and they raised interest rates 4 times. Now they're going to start reversing QE, which they've already done, all right? And we're going to probably see this all come to a head between late August and into early October, all right? And the fall, and we're going to see this really, really happen. And this is what has to be concerned. Michael Pinto, who actually is one of the most respected bond traders and managers on the market, states that cash levels are an all-time low on institutional balance sheets for the stock market. And margin debt is at an all-time high. And he states if that doesn't scare you coming into the fall, I think you really need a wake-up call. Now, this is why many people on Wall Street are getting very, very concerned. We have a no-growth economy for the most part for the past decade. Ominous signs pointing to big trouble ahead all around us. We have very disturbing mundane portents and astrological transits to the natal charts of the S&P 500, to the U.S. Natal chart, regardless what time you use, and a number of other institutions. And the only reason, by the way, why stocks have been able to perform as well as they have is the unprecedented intervention of global central banks, all right, through QE1, QE2, QE3. But they're not going to be able to keep inflating this bubble forever. And that is what the astrological portents are indicating. That is what this Pluto, transiting Pluto square Uranus, is indicating. The financial markets are far more primed for a crash than they were in 2008. And by the way, for those of you who haven't known me long enough, this is a fact. In 2007, in October 2007, I predicted that the country would be in a great recession, that the markets would crash before the spring of 2008. All right, by the spring of 2008, they actually happened a little bit later. All right, and the country was in a major recession called the Great Recession by 2009. I gave that lecture at the Long Island NCGR. When the crash occurred and the Lehman crisis commenced in September, I was asked again to speak at the Long Island NCGR. They bumped off the speaker for October. They had me come in and speak again, and their primary question was, just tell us this is all going to go away. And I told them, no, this is not going away. This is just the first phase, the first round of a major financial reset that will commence in the second half of the decade. Okay, so that's what I talked about. It will occur in the second decade of the first century. So it's very difficult to predict the year, but I think we're really there at this point. So that is one of the things I want to stress. I wanted to stress there's no growth. We have very ominous secular indicators, ominous mundane indicators, ominous transits. We know people have been going through some type of bipolar breakdown. The mood is not good out there. The M2 money supply is below the 1929 levels. And the financial markets are more primed for a crash than they were in 2008. And there are a lot of potential black swan events that could push us over the edge. Now, when I mentioned black swans are unknown unknowns, things that are almost impossible to predict and highly super improbable. But I have spoken about this a few weeks back and talk about how we're seeing the acceleration and development of mini black swans, all right, over the past 20 years, right? For example, you could argue that the election of Donald Trump was a black swan event. You could argue that the Arab Spring, when 18 nations went into simultaneous revolution, was a black swan event. You could argue that 9/11 was a black swan event. It may have been an engineered event, but it was a black swan event. You could also argue that the collapse of the Soviet Union, all right, was arguably one of the greatest black swan events in the history of civilization, all right, and which did not result in a third world war. Often, when civilizations are in crisis and collapse, they resort to war. When all else fails, they bring you to war, as they say, right? So I will end this, but I want to point out a couple of things. I already know you know these things. But for those of you who are still a little bit in denial, here are the facts. North Korea conducted an ICBM missile test, which proved they now have the capability of hitting some major U.S. cities on the West Coast and Alaska, all right? Every diplomatic effort to end the North Korean nuclear program has completely failed to date, and the Chinese have articulated to the mainstream media very clearly that they do not intend to do much of anything to intervene in the crisis. The Trump administration has announced that all American citizens are now banned from traveling to North Korea, and any remaining must leave the country by July 27th, or else their passport and insurance will be revoked. This is the kind of action you normally take just prior to war. All right? All right? Going back to Wall Street, the S&P 500 cyclically adjusted price to earnings cap valuation has only been greater on one occasion, and that was in the late 1990s, all right, around 1999. It is currently on par with levels preceding the Great Depression. The cap valuation, when adjusted for the prevailing economic growth trend, is more overvalued than during the late 20s and in the late 90s. So we are well overdue for some type of correction with the markets. And the S&P price to sales ratio is higher than it was than in 1999. All right. So the other thing is that the top 200 S&P 500 companies have pension shortfalls totaling $382 billion. And corporations like GE spent more on share buybacks, $45 billion, than the size of their entire pension shortfall, $31 billion. All right. This really tells you, all right, things aren't good here. And over the last 10 years, the S&P 500 corporations have returned more money to shareholders via buybacks and dividends than they have through earnings or growth. They have not generated that much growth, but the stock continues to go up because they increase their dividends and they continue to buy back more and more stock. All right. Now, let me finish off with this. For those of you who are still in denial, let me add this. Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan has stated 2 days ago that he believes we are on the verge of a bond bubble bust, saying, quote, "We are experiencing a bubble, not in stock prices, but in bond prices. The real problem is that when the bond market bubble collapses, long-term interest rates will automatically rise on their own," Greenspan said, close quote. He also goes on to say, quote, "We are moving into a different phase of the economy, to a level of stagflation not seen since the 1970s. That is not good for asset prices on the stock market," close quote. The Fed widely expected to announce plans for unwinding its 4.5 trillion, as I stated earlier, on its balance sheet, and central banks around the world are talking about scaling back stimulus and raising interest rates. And all this is happening while debt levels are at record high, and the entire banking system, especially in Europe, are in need of massive bailouts and financial liquidity in order for their governments and banks to continue to function. And last but not least, the US government will run out of money in less than 90 days, hitting the debt ceiling once again. The problem is now is they will not be able to automatically raise that debt ceiling. It will require an act of Congress, all right, and the Senate to raise that debt ceiling level, all right? And it's highly unlikely to happen, and yet it will run out of 90 days, within the 90 days, period. So what I'm saying here is that probably around this fall, they will run out of money, and they will not be able to find a way to get a budget going. And that will create a crisis into itself. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to take some of your questions. I know people are asking questions, and we're going to go look at the chart. Dimitri asked, did you ever compare? Okay, there we go. All right. The questions are all flooding in. Justine asks, what do you see that indicates the U.S. will experience a rebirth? Well, we always know with Pluto transits, we go through a rebirth, right? Anyone going through a very difficult Pluto transit, you can tell them it always gets darkest before dawn, and that generally, not generally, all deaths and transformation result in rebirths and renaissances to follow. This is the death of the old order and the destruction and death of the old order and the rebirth of a new order that is more vital, authentic, alive, that has more capacity for growth, and that is more in alignment with our deeper levels of soul and self-actualization, is actually part of the Pluto mythology and the Pluto archetypal matrix. So that's the reason I have that answer for that. We see that play itself out with in history with the Black Death in 1348, which actually set motion the Renaissance. Without the Black Death and the collapse of the serfdom and that particular economic social structure, we would not have had the Renaissance. It's quite arguable. We would not have seen the Renaissance occur when it did. And the Renaissance then set in stage the Reformation, the Reformation of the Catholic Church, which in itself was revolutionary. Okay, what do you see that indicates the U.S. will experience rebirth? I answered that question. Do I compare? Have I compared? Dimitri asked, did I compare the U.S. chart with the Russian charts? I have not done so yet. I don't really think that would be helpful at this moment, but I can allude to the fact that this eclipse will have a direct impact on U.S.-Russian relations. And if you want to know why and how and what I predict from that, I suggest you come to my eclipse webinar. I will give you details. I'll give you predictions. I will prove it out. I will dispel all your astrological skepticism that you constantly get exposed to by many of those astrologers, natal astrologers, pretending they're mundane astrologers, transpersonal astrologers that may have an understanding of archetypes but refrain from predicting. I am both transpersonal in my understanding of astrology and predictive in my understanding of mundane. All right, so I blend both together, and I will give you the perspective on that. What should we be doing about this to survive, Karen asked. And a lot of it has to taking proactive actions in your life. You're going to get intimations from the universe. The universe will always meet you halfway. If it says, hey, you should sell that house, you should keep mobile, all right? You shouldn't count on certain clients that you've been able to rely on in terms of an income source. You need to expand you need to open your horizons. You need to get more focused or intense on certain other things that you sort of been putting off. You need to get rid of that debt. You need to get rid of anything where you're overextended, where you need to address certain things that have been on the backlog. Those are all things that you can do right away to deal with this. If you feel that anything that is intimating within you that you should take action on is probably, and especially if it's outside your comfort zone, is the very thing that is going to put you from surviving into thriving during this period. All right. So I don't have everybody, that answer is different for everyone. But in general, it has to do with taking massive action on the very things that you are being coerced to confront with, getting down to the deeper issues of what's creating these symptoms, holding space more, being more self-aware, questioning authority, stop watching fake news, stop posting CNN and saying this is how it is and this. All right, realize that you are being manipulated. Most importantly, your money is being manipulated. That's why Bitcoin is taking off. That's why Ethereum hit 200. I had astrologers telling me Ethereum was worth nothing. It's going up, folks. This is a revolution. Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency. Everybody knows the government-backed fiat system is dead. So one of the things you can do is buy gold and silver, buy some Bitcoin, buy some Ethereum, okay? All right, start doing that. That will really empower your life, all right? So that's one of the things. Vicky asks, will the issue with Obamacare be remedied and rectified? I believe that has to be remedied and rectified within these next 4 years because Obamacare, the imposition Obamacare has on families, has on fact that it's being enforced by the IRS, that is increasing the level of penalties if people can't afford Obamacare, in itself is going to invoke social revolution much faster than the powers that be can anticipate. They have a much bigger problem than they are aware of. It's also going to aid in and abet in a tax revolt. It's very classic to see tax revolts occur. Historically, we've seen tax revolts occur throughout the centuries when you have Uranus, Pluto, and Saturn, Pluto activations. And you're going to see a merger of Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, Pluto start in 2018. So you're going to see a big issue with tax enforcement, Obamacare tax enforcement by the IRS. They'll blow back, setting the grounds for real tax reform. And I don't mean lowering taxes where they lower it by $300, right? And they tell you reelect me again, right? And they say reelect me because I lowered your taxes. No, I'm talking about true tax restructuring, all right? So that's how I see that. Now, for those of you who are asking me questions like, well, what about this country? What about that country? I've already done these forecasts. I have these webinars I did. I go into I take a deep dive into all the major alignments hitting those countries in particular, from the Aries ingress to the geodetic at a geodetic level with the geodetic lecture I gave. I've talked about this extensively with these webinars, right? So I would suggest you may want to get those webinars. You want to look at it and really where I take more of a deep dive into this. In this Facebook Live, the purpose here is just to go over the overview, right, to skim the surface of the bigger things that are going on. To prove it out beyond a shadow of a doubt at an astrological level is something I do in the webinars. Yeah, Adriana said people falling apart is what's happening in Venezuela. It's not only happening in Venezuela, it's happening in parts of Brazil. It's happening in many other countries. Look what's happening in Greece. Look what's happening in Italy right now, all right? Things are not going well in Italy, right? So it's happening. What we see happening in Venezuela is not going to stay in Venezuela. And I talk about that at length in my geodetic webinar, and I recommend that you may want to get that, all right, because that will probably teach you the power of geodetic astrology and how accurately and precisely predictive it is for not only knowing what's going to happen, but where it's going to happen. A lot of people are asking me about what the eclipse mean. Forget about all this Pluto stuff, William. Let's talk about the eclipse. All right, here's what's going on with that. Everything you want to know about the eclipse that hasn't been discussed, I will discuss it. I will not hold back. I am going to prove out and show with the eclipse. I'm also going to bring up a lot of information you probably don't know about eclipses. This has to do with the studies by Charles Jane, Edward Jandro, and others throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s who did outstanding predictive mundane work with eclipses, who have phenomenal track records, and they did this all without computers, right? I'm going to go into that all. I'm going to go into it, what it means on a transpersonal level, on a personal level, but most importantly, what it means for the U.S., what it means for the Trump administration. I will give the details. I will turn over every stone on that. All right. And I'm not going to play it down and just say, we can't really tell you what an eclipse is going to do. No. People who say that haven't done their homework. All right. So let me be very clear about that. We have a very good understanding. I'm going to prove out what eclipses have done historically using real events. I'm going to show that out first to build up my point. All right. So that's one of the reasons you may want to take this eclipse seminar. All right. Because here, what I'm trying to discuss today is the large cycles that are working. Everything is leading to this eclipse, and this eclipse is very much tied into 2020, all right? And I'll explain why 2020 is also significant, all right? So for those of you who keep asking me about the eclipse, just know I'm holding back and reserving, all right, because it goes beyond the scope of what we're doing here with Facebook Live. But I can assure you, for those who have studied the works of Jane, the works of, the published works of Meridian, and others who've done excellent work with eclipse forecasting and prediction, we can say enough, especially when we coordinate it with the secular trends, the financial markets, what has been transpiring, all right, over the past 9 months geopolitically, where we can make very informed speculations on where the crisis is, what the level of intensity will be, and how it will ultimately manifest in a larger sense, all right, on the world stage, and what it means from an archetypal perspective relevant to the development and growth of our civilization from an evolutionary standpoint. Yeah, so someone asked, hey, so William, cut to the chase. So you talking about war? Well, I'm going to say that we have the probability of a war. There's a probability war has to actually be addressed. Will it happen? That's a very complex question that has a series of possible answers. However, that being said, we are currently in a financial war. We are currently in a trade war. Financial wars result in trade wars, which generally lead to shooting wars. I would say right now that what's happening between Korea and the United States is essentially about the trade and financial war going on between the U.S. and China. All right? So, when people say, there's no prospect of war going on, I just say the opposite. I say we're more likely to be in a war. Generally, when all else fails with financial markets and economics, they take you to war. We saw this back in the 30s that resulted in World War II in the 40s. We saw that again in the early 1900s, which resulted in World War I in 1914. So will there be a war? The probability of that is still relatively low, but it's there now. It's something we have to address on the table. The question is, will it be a world war? Will it be a regional war? Will it stay as an economic war? Will it maintain that level? Right? Maybe the war has nothing to do with the country. Maybe it has to do with another civilization, another group. Maybe the U.S. is already at war with another force. all right? Another civilization, another technology. Maybe that's really what the deeper crisis is about, all right? And it seems to be clear that there's a convergence of three crises going on, not just one, all right? And again, that's something I'll go into the eclipse talk, all right, about what those crises are, what I believe they will be. All right, so we're going to close it up here. I want to thank you all for watching. Please send your questions in advance to William Q&A on Facebook and Twitter. All right, you can hashtag me with William Q&A, and I'll try and address those questions proactively. And yes, those of you I didn't get to answering your question, I'll definitely try and get to it in the next upcoming Facebook Live. Just to let you know, this Facebook Live is evolving. I'm improving the equipment. I'm using different technology. I'm trying to, it's very hard for me to read my notes. It's very hard for me to manage everything. So I'm going to make certain changes over the forthcoming weeks that will really improve it, make it flow better, make it seem more natural, and hopefully I'll get more comfortable talking with you all. It'd be much easier if I could see you all rather than just talking to a blank screen. So I just want to say that, and I want to thank you again for attending, and hopefully you're getting much out of this, and hopefully you can hold space for this and contemplate what I have discussed, see how it relates to your own personal lives. I can assure you much of what I'm talking about, I know for a fact. I have clients call me all over the world, and they are now in a struggle for survival in their marriage, in their business, in their corporate life, with their children. There is a survive, thrive mentality. There's a certain dark moodiness going on, a sense of maybe it's not going to get better, a sense of taking extreme positions. This is all impacting us. And the idea is to hold space for that and see what it's evoking in you, what changes need to happen, and realize that you are part of the solution for all the intractable problems for this country. You are part of the solution, or you are the resistance. You are the greatest threat to the oligarchy. You are the greatest threat for their plan for global domination under the guise of a global democracy. All right, you have ways to fight the extend and pretend policies of government that continue to revoke and take away your rights, limit your economic freedom, penalize you, excessively tax you. You have the power, but you have to take power in your own personal life, all right? And then that will make a shift and change within the within the family, within the community, and within the state, and eventually in the nation. So it all starts with you, and realize that from listening to this and contemplating this, that you're the person who can set the narrative for your own empowerment and emancipation, to live a life that's more fulfilling, more purpose-driven, and less about playing into the consumption model that every day in every way you're always being drawn into due to the excessive manipulation and commercialization of our news, our media. So you can break out of that cycle. And I think that's part of what this rebellion's about, is to think differently, think outside of the box, to make decisions that get you to move more and more outside of your comfort zone. The more you do that, the faster things are going to start improving and changing, and have a much more powerful effect that will reverberate through the collective. Thank you very much, and I'm going to end the broadcast now. See you next week.